live in an age of instant information, so isn't it strange that things have been hidden away from us? Governments think we need to gain their trust, but it's the other way around. Just take a look. Nothing tells us more than raw data does, so it's important it's all available to us. Plus, put up for debate and looked at by the public's gaze, because there's a lot...
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. First off, this is actually our 30th episode. 30 whole episodes. When we started, we weren't sure that we'd even have enough material for 5, let alone 30. And now our list of topics keeps on growing. We've got plenty to come. To those of you who have been listening from the very beginning, thank you very much. For those of you who have picked it up along the way, please feel free to go back and check out some of those earlier episodes. Now, for the first 29 of those episodes, we've always recorded them with all the participants in the same place, including the 2 live episodes that we did for certain events. And when we normally record, we use some nice recording equipment to make sure that the sound quality is good and that we sound clear and crisp. One problem with this is that it limits our guests to those who are within physical proximity. There are, of course, ways around this. Some podcasts just record Skype phone calls and expect people to deal with the poor sound quality, and often I find that to be somewhat annoying. Another option is to have everyone on a computer-based call record themselves locally and then stitch the separate recordings together. This option is appealing, but involves a fair bit of work, enough that we've never actually tried to do it, though we may in the future. For today's podcast, our original plan was to use a new service out there called Ringr.us that claims to do all of this for you, automatically recording callers locally and then magically stitching it together into a single file. In fact, we have been trying for the past hour or so to get this to work, and it hasn't. It hasn't worked at all. We have run into all sorts of problems with poor sound quality, echoes, feedback, and more. So we're moving back to the more classic solution of Skype, the one that I said I didn't like so much before, but we are trying it out here, recording it on my computer via Skype, which means that the overall recording quality shouldn't be quite as clear as our usual ones. But in our testing, the quality via Skype was already much better than with just Ringr. Sorry, Ringr. Either way, for this podcast, we wanted to try and do it this way, remotely, in order to discuss whether or not we're reaching a point where proximity really doesn't matter as much. It's been one of those holy grails for years. Better communication through technology, lessening the need for in-person interaction. Telecommuting is a viable option these days. In fact, I've never even met some of the people that I've worked with for years. But there is still something to the idea of actually being face-to-face and being able to interact that way. So for today's podcast, we'll use Skype and not Ringr to discuss whether or not we can reach an age where proximity won't matter as much, and if we're really heading down that path already. Dennis, welcome back. Let's kick this off with the big question of whether or not you still think face-to-face matters, and whether or not technology is helping to minimize the need for face-to-face.
I think the answer to that question is yes. Right? I mean, like, both of those things kind of are correct, right? Like, face-to-face still does matter. The communication fidelity that you get when you meet someone in person is still vastly superior than, over teleconference or telephone, instant message, all of the different kind of remote communication vehicles that we have today. None of them really still kind of comes close to what you get when you meet someone face to face, right?
Yeah, even including video, right?
Yeah, I mean, video is pretty good. And I've been in some of those conference rooms that have like the wall of video, and it's getting there, right? And you definitely, are able to communicate with people. And I was frankly surprised at how rich like a video conference was, like face to face. Now that you can see someone, you can see the nuances of the nonverbal communication, but still being in person is better, right?
Yeah.
And that said, the other side of your question is the technology making it better? I think it's also it's also yes, right? So it's kind of like, if you're able to meet someone face to face, I still much prefer meeting in person, right?
Yeah.
But the beauty of technology now is that we're no longer limited. So maybe 80% communication with someone that's 3,000 miles away is better than, a 100% communication that's going to happen in 2 days or 3 days, right?
Yeah. And I think, I think that feels sort of obvious, right? I mean, I think even when you have like, and I've seen some of those giant teleconferencing, like the half room,
Right.
teleconferencing.
Like you actually build like a half of a conference table,
Yeah.
and butt it up to the screen, and then the other half of the conference table is built on the other side, of the conference room, which is actually pretty. It's kind of beautiful.
Yeah,
So.
no, it's very, very cool, but it's still not the same. There's just something about, and whether or not like you like shaking hands or hugging people or whatever, there's still something about actually being physically present, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and I can say definitely for those developers that are into pair programming, sitting with somebody around one computer and having one person typing and the other person just kind of navigating, it's hard to replicate that experience over a headset or even on a shared screen. It's getting better, but there is something like pointing at the screen. You can you can use the mouse for that, but it's better.
I mean, do you think that like we're getting more and more of these more immersive kinds of technologies? Like
VR or Oculus
exactly, both of the VR or the augmented reality kinds of things that really sort of take over all of your eyesight perception to some extent. Do you think that it could ever reach the point where that virtual connection feels as close as, or instead of maybe 80% there, or do you
it'll become 90%, and then you're missing like smell. You can't
right.
smell the person that's next to you, which in the case of some experiences is probably
that could be, yeah. Though, and there have been efforts to do smell digitally as well. So,
streaming smell is not quite here yet. But
yeah, well, they're trying. They're trying, but again, I'm not sure that you would want that kind of fidelity.
Some things are best left not turned. So if we don't have to,
yeah.
I mean, there's one thing to kind of discuss, and this conversation it naturally leads to kind of telework and like what that means.
Right.
Like I know with Tector, like we've been kind of a virtual organization since the very beginning, and I think that's very different. Like I've worked in both virtual organizations and in organizations in which I've been remote, and I find them to be entirely different, right? And the big difference is that in a virtual organization, basically it's the entire team is virtual, so you're kind of forced into using the modes of communication that lend itself to telework. So like with working with you, everyone logs into the chat room every morning. This is before the days of Slack.
Right. We sort of made our own Slack.
Yeah, and everyone is very communicative over email and IM, and then if needed, you'll hop onto voice, right?
Right.
But actually, pretty rarely, I think we hopped onto even voice, or very rarely used like video conference, because instant message was so. That was the de facto method of communication in a virtual organization, right?
Right.
And I think organizations like Automatic, the folks who make WordPress, are also very good at this. That's a virtual organization, and from what I hear, the culture is very much virtual. So it's to the extent that they apparently hold interviews remotely just to make sure that that's the office. So if you can't interview remotely, then you're not going to work well in that team. So I'd love to chat with him at some point about how that works with them. But I would kind of compare this to a remote work situation, which I did for a while, where I was the sole remote member of a team.
Mm-hmm.
And even though like I was like, I'm sitting here at my computer all day, just Skype me in or like just turn me on. I actually had my own. I had my own computer there. I was like, just leave me on, viewing the room and take me into whatever meetings that happen. And it was just so difficult. People forget to include you when you're not there. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's true. And I have seen people talk about, one of the wonders of things like Skype and other kinds of, audio and video chat is the fact that you can just leave it on all day. And I've heard stories of remote workers doing that so that they still have that audio connection, but it's still not the same as actually being there and being a part of it.
I mean, they also have the telepresence robots.
Right.
It's an iPad mounted on like a little, set of wheels that you can drive around the office.
Right, which Ed Snowden uses to show up at various conferences. But
yeah, and it was in an episode of Modern Family, I think, a few weeks ago. So, that technology is interesting as well, and I think that it can provide a real physical presence. And I do wonder if that would have made a difference in my remote work experience if I could drive my little robot into a meeting and say like, hey guys, what's going on over here?
Yeah, I mean it still feels like, yeah, I mean again, yes, I think that's better than nothing, or better than just asking someone to pick up a laptop and move you around.
Yeah.
But it still feels like you would have some limited perception, which could be problematic.
Right. I mean, there are senses that we definitely are not replicating. I think sight and sound are only two senses, and I forget what the latest count is, but there's actually, there's more than just the normal ones that we learned in school. There's
right. Yes.
Heat and scent and pressure and
itching and yes, there's all sorts of different senses beyond the few that we were taught, the 5 that we were taught. But
exactly.
But then also, there are some other oddities too, where even sound works differently, right? Where when you're actually physically present, it's much easier to sort of focus what you're listening to.
Right.
And to, say, okay, don't sort of, your brain and your ears are pretty good at tuning out certain parts of a room and tuning into the stuff that you do want to hear. That becomes a little bit more difficult once it's first filtered through a computer microphone and into a pair of headphones. It's not quite the same level. And so, I've definitely heard of cases where people are, virtually, I had this experience not too long ago where there was a meeting of a bunch of sort of internet freedom activist folks at a big conference, and I couldn't attend in person, and so they asked me to attend via Skype or computer. I forget what app we used in particular. And so I did it, and I sort of had that same issue where people were kind of moving around the laptop and like, hey, can I look at something besides the ceiling, or things like that. But the really big problem was just I couldn't tell like who was talking when and where, and when people sort of broke out into different conversation, like separate conversations around this big table.
Right.
It was impossible for me to distinguish, one conversation from another, and I couldn't just focus in on the conversation that I was closest to, because all the sound was kind of coming in equally. And so, and there are obviously ways that you can deal with that, but you have to get a lot more sophisticated before we can get there.
Yeah, but so I mean, maybe VR would help if it were a truly immersive experience, and you could, turn your head, and it's also about focus, right? Like, being able to focus and engage, and look at people. And the other thing I think is interesting is when you're with somebody, the nonverbal cues kind of direct you when it's your turn to talk. If like all of these pieces that are kind of communicated even through video, but are lost.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that makes a big difference. And in fact, I was kind of wondering even how this call would work. I mean, it's easier with two people, but I think if we had more than two people on like this call, it becomes a lot more difficult. When we're in a room and we're all recording together, we're making eye contact and we know who wants to speak next, and we see expressions on people's faces, and it allows us to respond that way. Whereas on a call like this, we're sort of going in blind, and it's
Yeah.
definitely a lot trickier. Again, I think it works okay with two people. I think it probably can be okay with three people, but I think if you get anywhere beyond that, it's nearly impossible.
Yeah. But
Um,
but I think on the other side is like then what what does this ability open us up to, right? So in the case that we're not limited by physical location anymore, like we could probably bring guests in from anywhere now, right?
yeah,
So I mean that has to be a huge advantage, I think.
yeah, no, and I would love to, and I think that we'll probably try and experiment with that at some point.
Right.
Um, you
And we
know,
could probably do a mix of, the three of us sitting in a room again, and then the guest on a computer, and we can try that probably
yeah,
um, with the video feed, so we can try and get those nonverbal cues.
get at least some of the nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth trying. I just I still find it I still find it interesting, especially in an age where definitely remote working has become much more common, and I do wonder if what new technologies are being developed to make that even better, um, and because it feels like to date, like the improvements which have definitely made it possible to do remote working and telecommuting and things like that are good, but it feels like they've just been sort of incremental improvements, right?
Yeah. I mean, voice and video calling has been around for a while now. It's been getting a little bit better, but what's next, right?
Yeah, and that's why the obvious leap, next step would be the immersive VR kind of situation, and I mean people have been trying that for years, but it
Right.
has never really
But if I have to
caught
wear
on.
a VR headset in the office, does that take away from me being physically, like, does it degrade the entire experience of working if everyone in your office has to wear a VR headset now?
Well, the question is, do you have to wear it all the time, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, and then it becomes a question of, will the nature of VR headsets themselves change, right? I mean, you could imagine a world in the not too distant future where it gets whittled down into just the level of like a Google Glass or a contact
Right.
lens or something like that,
Right.
in
I
which
mean,
case,
I think the vision of computing that was in the movie Her
hmm
was kind of an interesting one where, it becomes so natural and so ubiquitous such that the computing hardware kind of fades away into the background, right?
right,
Like that was I don't know if you remember, that was the computer. Basically, you sit at a desk and just start talking, and it would interface with you because there was no monitor, there was no keyboard. It's just sitting there talking, right?
right,
And that was kind of the big shift from the old Minority Report view of the future, which was the documents floating around in space kind of interface, which I think was the de facto sci-fi interface for a while.
right. But I mean, but then there are things like Microsoft's HoloLens, right?
Oh,
Which
I haven't seen that. What's that?
so that's sort of I want to say kind of going back to the
Hmm.
the Minority Report documents floating in the air, right? So it is a kind of it's augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality,
Okay.
right? So it is you put on these glass-like
Right.
things, and everything appears in front of you, and so you can call up whatever. You can still see the world around you, but you can also see additional things.
Right.
And it is immersive, but also doesn't take you out of the real world that you're in. And so you could potentially see a world in which when you want your colleague to appear sitting in front of you, they could appear, even if they're not really there, and then they could go away. And so, at the same time, it also gives you all the advantages of, having a computer screen attached to your face so that you can call up documents. So you could do document sharing, where literally you could have two people in, remote parts of the world from each other, effectively feeling like they're standing around a table looking at the same document. So, like what you were talking about with pair programming before, or something where you're, someone wants to point at the screen. You could conceivably, I don't think the HoloLens is at that point yet.
Right.
But people are definitely thinking about it, and we're developing the precursors for the technology that will allow that to happen.
Right.
And so that's, I actually think that's pretty powerful, and kind of interesting too, because it could change a lot of things. I'm sort of infamous for people who know how I carry around my office in a bag, which all too well. I have a separate portable screen, and a fold-up ergonomic keyboard and a fold-up mouse and all this stuff, and I can set up an entire workstation in a couple minutes. And it's great for productivity because having like the two screens and all of that is just super helpful for me. But you could picture a world where you move to kind of a HoloLens world where the entire world is your screen, and then the whole concept of using a computer itself doesn't matter so much, whether you have a voice interface or a typing interface or some other kind of interface. The fact that you can just put anything anywhere within your field of vision becomes very different, and then I could definitely see that merging with the idea of remote workers and creating a very different kind of world.
I mean, I suppose in the inner world in which we actually jack in Romantic style or Matrix style, then that's definitely the ultimate level of telework. But I feel like we're a little ways away from that.
I think we're ways away from that.
But a year or two?
Yeah, at least. But there are definitely things that are making this more and more possible. And if you go back, honestly, like not that long ago, the idea of teleworking was still really kind of dismissed as not being an effective idea.
Right.
And yet today, tons and tons of companies have some sort of teleworking program, or at least one that is partial teleworking or partial in the office. And so the idea of being able to interact remotely like that has certainly come a really long way. And I think I mean,
yet as we've discussed in a previous podcast, like areas like Silicon Valley, locales that are very specific still have a lot of power, right?
Absolutely.
In terms of growing companies and attracting talent. So we're getting there, but it doesn't seem like it's there. And if anything, I mean, I don't know if it's actually the consolidation of these locales is like in what direction are the trends going? Is it actually consolidating more or not? Like, I'm not sure. So.
Yeah, but I kind of wonder if that is. I mean, it feels like you're right that is a contradiction, but I'm not sure, because I think the reasons why, like Silicon Valley being a location where there's lots of engineers and lots of stuff happening is important, is different than the question of teleworking, right? So there are a few different things. There's a bit of nuance in there, right? Where, what's useful about Silicon Valley being Silicon Valley is what you were talking about in that podcast. And if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, so we don't have to repeat ourselves. But is the idea of like the serendipitous bumping into someone,
right?
And you have stories like that, and so that still works, but that's different than
telework.
Yes and no, right? So there's still like the serendipitous of bumping into people at the office,
Right.
which is important. But
So you're saying that, I mean, the loss of the water cooler, like how do we actually replicate that? Where you're just hanging out, grabbing a soda, talking to people, right, in an unplanned meeting?
no, well, I'm not saying that. I mean that is an issue that comes up. But I think that there are some ways to replicate that.
Mhm.
For us, we have a chat room called the water cooler.
Yeah, and I actually have been invited to a few Slack groups lately. That there's like a Silicon Valley product manager Slack right now, where basically a ton of product managers are just gathering around in a all day chat room, just
Yep.
kind of chatting about anything.
Yep.
I don't think it's very productive. I turned it on for about 10 minutes, and it was just so much going on that I was like, this is just not,
Yeah.
it's not productive.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to kind of replicate that hangout,
Yeah.
hanging out feeling.
Yeah, and I mean, I have the same thing where I've been invited to a few different. Nowadays it's always Slacks,
Yep.
and one with a bunch of like music entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing where it's like, oh, this is great, and there's like all these great people from around the world. It's in fact not very American based at all. There's people from all over the world doing really interesting things in the sort of music tech space, and there are some interesting conversations, but it's I have a job to do every day, and so I can't hang out with those people. Like these are people that I like to, see when I go to a conference and hang out with and get a drink with or get dinner with when I go to a conference. But
But I'm almost tempted to write a bot to listen to the chat room, and then if there's anything interesting, it would kind of ping me and say, "Hey."
Well, Slack lets you do keywords.
Right.
That will ping you.
That will ping you, yeah.
And that's handy, but not quite the same. I mean, I'm sure you could make a more sophisticated bot.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting, and I actually, I mean, it hadn't been the point when we started this, but as we discussed it, I mean, I do think the idea of the more immersive worlds could create something much more interesting.
I mean, once you can actually hang out with people in just a casual setting.
Yeah, but then it raises the other issues of when and how, right? I mean, so the problem that we're both discussing with kind of these Slack chat rooms is the fact that they're always on, and pretty quickly people realize like, I like these people and I like to talk to them in like particular settings, but it's not my day job, and so I can't be doing that all the time. And so that creates a challenge. And so I think you would have that same challenge with sort of the immersive things. And, people have tried to do things where they do like virtual conferences, which are sort of immersive experiences like that, but for a limited period of time. Yeah. And, most of them just don't seem to work at all for a variety of reasons that feel pretty, sensible.
Nice.
But I kind of wonder if we do get to a world where we are more used to experiencing immersive worlds on a regular basis, if that suddenly becomes a more reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, in order for a truly virtual conference to work, it would almost have to be like everyone signs on to a system, and then randomly you're put into groups of 3 or 4 people, and you can talk and you have like 3 minutes to discuss, then you get shaken up again, you get randomly inserted into another group, and
like speed dating but for conferences.
Yeah, that actually might be kind of a weird / fun. Probably more weird.
Well, there's one element to this which we sort of accidentally touched on when talking about the water cooler, which is so much of that kind of interaction actually tends to happen over food, food and drinks. People get coffee or get lunch or things like that, and until we figure out a way to eat virtually, that element may always be missing to some extent.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. So now we just got to figure out how to make food virtual, and I'm not talking about crazy things like Soylent or whatever other ideas.
I think there was food in Second Life. I'm not quite sure, but
I don't know.
they probably tried it, yeah.
Yeah, it's still not the same thing. Not the same thing. But anyways, I think we've driven this about as far as it's going to go. And so, it's an interesting thought process, interesting thought experiment, and an interesting real experiment where we do this remotely. I don't intend to make this a habit that we'll do all the time, but we may do it some of the time. And if it works out well, and if the quality is okay, which we'll judge after we've finished this, maybe we can start to experiment with having, bringing in some folks from the outside who aren't necessarily sitting right there with us, and we can have some fun with some guests to the podcast who are not in San Francisco at the moment. But it'll be interesting to see how the technology evolves. Do you have any sort of final thoughts on remote?
I mean, anything? I think for this experience, recording a podcast with everyone in the same room is, I'm going to say, 10 times, 100 times better than doing.
So now that you've listened to 30 minutes of this podcast, we're telling you this one kind of sucks. This one's only about 5% as good as all of our other ones. But too late, you already listened, so.
And thank you for listening.
Thank you for suffering through this horrible experience. No, it is definitely like, this is, I always enjoy talking to you, Dennis, but it's not as nice and not as much fun as doing it in person. I think and
it's not just a sound quality thing. It's
right.
Even though we are recording just the sound.
Yeah.
Kind of strange to say that, but.
Yeah, just the interaction being like, just eye contact and facial expressions and things like that, and just actually, being present makes a real difference, and it feels different.
In the aura of Masnick.
That is not even slightly what I was implying or trying to say. But on that note, I think we're going to end this one. And we should be back next week. I have no idea what we're going to be talking about. I have a few ideas, trying to figure out which one we're going to go for. But we will try and do it back in person, and perhaps with Hirsch back again. He's been away, or perhaps with a guest, or perhaps with both of them. We will have to see. But thank you once again for listening, for hopefully checking out all 30 of the podcasts so far. And we hope to be here for many, many, many more. So we'll be back next week. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Dennis, for doing this experiment with me. And sorry we wasted about an hour beforehand experimenting with other technologies, but it's all fun.
Sounds good.
All right.
See you next week.
Bye.